before you know, she sounds better than the like the GPS lady, you know, because there have been times you know, with the GPS lady, you know, you make the wrong turn and you can kind of hear the eye roll and recalculating.
Yeah.
Like, sorry. Okay, so questions? Does anybody have any questions or any comments before we get rolling with tonight's lessons? Don't all talk at once. No, looks like we're good. Okay, well, so tonight we have two videos, and so we're kind of heading towards the finish line on this, which I think is kind of exciting. So let us sleeves and collar first. So we're going to be installing the sleeves and the collar first, and then we're going to be starting the hemming and so forth. So as usual, you know, give me a shout out if you have a question. I can stop the video. So let's get rolling. As you can see, I've pinned the back. This is the back. Here's the center back seam. I pinned the sleeve to the back at the raglan line. Now, again, see, this is where this comes in handy. I need to know which way is facing front so that this portion of the sleeve is the back, and I can pin it then to the raglan line. What I will do off camera, I'm going to pin the other sleeve to the other side and sew both of these seams. Then we will meet at the pressing table for the next step. So here we are at the pressing table. We press everything as sewn first. And then, since this is an inside curve, we're going to be pressing the seam allowances towards the sleeve. So what we want to do is we don't want to clip into this curve here. So we're going to stretch it opposite. And what that's going to look like is so by stretching that curve this way, it's going to open up that seam allowance and it will tip over quite nicely. So let me do the other side. This is the other raglan seam. So this is just a little tip so that you don't have to clip into your seam allowance. It doesn't interrupt the seam allowance. It makes a stronger seam. Now, next, I'm going to get out the sleeve board and I'm going to press the seams towards the sleeve. Now, before I press the seam allowances to the sleeve, I'm going to do a similar thing as I did at the neck earlier. I want to clip. This is at the underarm, the intersection where the raglan is going to meet the side seam. I want to press this open here and also up here. So this clip is about an inch down from the cut edge here. What this does is where you're going to be joining the collar and the facing, it reduces the bulk somewhat. So I'm going to press that open and then press the rest of the seam allowance towards the sleeve. So what that will look like here, just get this in range. There's that. And then bit by bit, going to press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. And so here, this is where you're going to be glad you stretched this, because the seam allowance will lay flat now. And then again, that presses open right there. So there we are. I will go off camera and press the other side and meet you back at the work table. Here I have the sleeves sewn to the back panel. Now this is where I explain what I'm thinking here. I'm planning on top stitching this by hand. That is why I sew the back to the sleeves, because really what I have found is that when hand stitching, it's easier to roll the fabric up. And so the hand stitching, when you have the sleeve joined to the back, if you join the sleeves to the front, you could do the same thing. But I find that it's easier joining the sleeves to the back, because once you have the front on, you can roll the fronts to the sleeves, but you can't roll the fronts to the sleeves to the back. It just makes hand stitching this seam allowance, or this seam, easier. So now I will go off camera and sew the same chain stitch with the ribbon floss to both of these seam allowances. And once I'm finished, I'll bring you back the results.
Kenneth,
Yes.
good evening. This is Paula.
Hi.
Hi. When you're doing the chain stitch, do you start from top to bottom, or does it matter?
It just depends on it depends on personal taste, but what I do is I start at the bottom and work towards the top, because then the round part of the chain stitch faces upward.
Okay.
And so what I try to, I try to be consistent on it. Now, when I'm doing the chain stitch on the front, I still started from below to above, but at the center back, as I remember, I'd have to look at the well, actually on the collar, if we look at this, and I'm sure we'll get a good look, that I change directions at the center back. So I start at the front and work to the center back, and then I start again at the front and work to the center back, so it meets at the center back.
Okay.
Okay, did that help?
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
Other questions? Okay, well, we continue.
So here we have the raglan seam with the ribbon floss chain stitch as the top stitch. Now you notice here at the underarm, I've stopped it about an inch below the seam allowance here. And as I have done on the other rows of the chain stitching, I've stopped it, about 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge, so that you don't have to worry about catching that into the seam or inadvertently clipping it when you install the collar. So the sleeves are sewn to the back. Now I will go off camera and sew the fronts to the sleeves and sew the chain stitch and bring you back the result. So here I am, back from sewing the sleeves onto the fronts and sewing the top stitching. So it's starting to look like a coat. But one thing, before we sew the underarm and the side seam, we want to place the cuff latch. Now the cuff latch, there's a placement mark on the pattern. So what I do, I like to just mark it on the garment. So this is the lower mark on the pattern, and it is, if you need a number, 3.5 inches from the cut edge. And you can see here, what I've done is I've basted the cuff latch to the sleeve, pointing opposite. So that is what I will do over here. So here is the other cuff latch on the other sleeve, because once we have this positioned, we can then sew the underarm seam and the side seam. So let me just place that right there. And you try to make it parallel to the cut edge. It's not going to really matter because it's just going to catch into the seam here. This is just to keep the thing from flapping around like a screen door. So really, I'm just going to sew a tailor baste. And this will hold everything together while I'm working. And there we are. So I can trim that thread. So here we are. The cuff latch is now secure. So really the next step I'm going to do off camera because there's no mystery to it. We really turn these inside out, pin from the cuff to the underarm and then down, and sew in one long seam. I will bring back the results. And here we have the main body of the coat sewn together.
Kenneth,
Yes.
directional sewing from the bottom all the way, from the armpits out. How
I
is
generally
there a method to your madness?
not really. I generally start at the cuff to the armpit to the hem. I just sew it all
Okay,
in one
thank
pass.
you.
Yeah.
There's the cuff latch. It actually catches in the underarm seam. Ultimately, where this will go is this will fasten back with a button here. So there we have the underarm seams sewn. So since it's starting to look like a coat, the next thing the coat needs is the collar. That will be the next step. Now that we have the body sewn together, it's now time to put on the collar. So as you can see here, we have the collar already constructed. So we have a lot of work to do. Let's proceed. To begin, I've sewn 3/8 of an inch from the cut edge, because this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, all around the neck edge. All the way around. So you can see it catches the stay tape. I've narrowed down the seam allowances at the shoulders before I sewed to reduce some of that bulk. So we have the stay stitch of the neck so it doesn't stretch. Next, I'm going to be clipping before I start installing the collar. So really what you want to do is you just want to clip to the stay stitching. And these clips are, about 1/4 of an inch or so apart. You work all the way around. Here's the center back. Heading over to the front panel. Here we are. We have all of our seam allowances clipped. From here, I'll bring in the collar and we'll start pinning the collar to the body. here is center back seam right here. And so how I visualize this, I always like to, I have to get oriented. So let's see, there, that is the center back seam on the collar. And again, have to get oriented here. There we are. There is the center back seam on the body. No, actually it's right there. So now it's going to look a little wonky because we have top stitched over here, but there is the actual center back seam on the body itself. So now, see, ultimately, you want these two to match. And so you put the under collar, right side, to the right side on the body. Now I'm going to, foolishly, I put these pins in upside down. So these two will match. And so you pin them one on top of the other. Like so. From here, you work out one side. And notice I'm pinning perpendicular here. This is because I'm going to thread base this. So I don't have to worry about any pulling out of pins when I go to the machine, because there will be no pins as I go to the machine. So I find it's easier to find the dead center back and work my way out from the center outward. So what I will do is continue pinning this and go off camera and pin the other side, and I will bring you back the results. See you in a few moments. Almost done. Okay, so now that we have it pinned, because like I said, we started in the center back and we worked this way, you want to check it.
Can
Make
I
sure
ask
the
a
collar
quick
is on.
question?
Sure, go ahead.
This is Kit.
Yeah.
Can you help me remember on the collar, have we stitched the two raw edges together?
Yes.
Are they?
Yes.
They're stitched together, but we didn't clip the collar. We just clipped the coat edge, but not the collar. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, because the collar is the line on the collar is, I wouldn't say dead straight, but it's more straight than not. So you don't really have to clip the seam allowance on the collar.
Okay, but they're sewn together. All right, thank you. I'm not that far, so I
Okay.
forgot. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So well, little bit of replay here.
The results. See you in a few moments. Almost done. Okay, so now that we have it pinned, because like I said, we started in the center back and we worked this way, you want to check it to make sure the collar is on completely centered. And this is how I do it. What I'll do is I'll come here and I'll match these two edges and see if the edges of the collar land at the same place, because you want the distance from the end of the collar to the corner to be consistent on both sides. And, you know, if you check, yes, they both hit. So that means this collar is placed properly. So from here, what I'm going to do here is to thread based. Now, this is one of those times when I will thread based here with what's in the machine. I will thread baste on top of the stay stitching. So this is all going to be about 1/8 of an inch inside the seam line. So it will be all okay. And using the same color as what you have in the machine means that if you really don't want to rip it out, you can sort of not rip it out. I know I'm speaking heresy here, but okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to make you watch me sew this whole thing. I'm going to go off camera and sew the rest, and I'll meet you back here. Almost finished. Okay, so I will secure the thread. There we are. So everything is basted on, and one more check. I just like to make completely sure that these are even. So what I'm doing here is I'm matching the two ends of the body. And I just want to make sure that both ends of the collar are at the same point, and they are. So now I'm going to run over to the machine. And when I sew, I'm going to sew with the stay tape up, and I'm going to sew again right on that stay stitch. I'm not going to sew the final seam yet. I'm going to be sewing at 3/8 of an inch, and that will solidify the collar. So I will bring it back when I'm done. And here the collar is set on. Next step, before the facing, we're going to be addressing the hem. But at this point, let's just enjoy the work that we've done.
I've got a question about the facing.
Yes.
Okay, I waited, I did my bound buttonholes, but I was hesitant about putting the facing on until now you're going over it. So would I wait and put the facing on in this step before doing the silk organza buttonholes and finishing it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
You want the facing completely installed, because if you put the face, if you put those bound buttonhole, the organza on before it's completely installed, what I have found is it's going to miss just enough to buckle.
Okay.
Okay.
I wanted to make sure that I was missing something about that. I'm going to wait until I get to that facing installation.
Okay. So, okay, I'm just looking at the chat here. I set up a remind group for us, similar to GroupMe. Phone numbers are private. We could text each other with questions, comments, and congratulations. So if anyone would like to participate in this, then you are.
And that's me. I'm a math professor in my daytime, and so I do that for my own students. And I thought, well, we could, if anybody wants to join, it's easy, and if you don't like it, you can opt out. And anyway,
Great.
I just thought it'd be fun, and yeah, give it a shot.
There you go.
Well,
There
my
you go.
students like it. Yeah.
Okay. So, questions before we continue? Okay, then. So let's start putting the facing on this thing. There we are. Okay. And we're off and running.
I have cut enough bias strips to interface the cuffs. The bias strips are 2 inches wide. They're cut out of the tailoring canvas. And I have also cut enough length to interface the hem. Now, if you have a half yard of the canvas, you may have to splice to make one long continuous strip for the hem. So this is how I do it. I like to use bias strips and piece of silk organza. So what this will look like here, when we join the two, we actually want to join it on the grain. So happily, this particular canvas has the lengthwise grain as part of the weave. So it's a little easier for me to show you. So what we want to do is we have this cut on the lengthwise grain. And so,
Question?
No. Sorry.
Okay.
we want grain lines to face the same way. And so here, again, we cut these on the straight grain. So what we'll do here, pin this, or we put the edges together and we pin the organza over. Now the organza doesn't have to be on the bias. I like an organza rather than muslin because you don't want to create stiffness. You just want to create a join. And if you have a little bit down here or up here that you need to level off later, not to worry. But the object here is you want these two sitting edge to edge underneath the organza. So now that we have this finished, we're going to go over to the sewing machine to sew. So here we are under the machine and you can see the cut edge. So we're going to be using a serpentine stitch. You could use just a straight zigzag if you wish. The width on the serpentine is 5.0 and the length is 1.0. You want this fairly short. We have motorcycles outside. Didn't know that my neighborhood was a haven for motorcycles. As you can see, I'm making sure that both these cut edges match. So then turn it around. And again, turn it back around. So we're sewing first right down the cut and then either side. Show you the result here. There. And that's what it looks like on this side. So what's nice about it is you don't necessarily get a hinge because the first row of stitching straddles the two joins. From here, I will take this over to the pressing table and press it, and I will meet you back at the work table.
Kenneth,
Yes.
are you doing that because you don't want a bulk or a seam in the middle?
Right.
Instead of like overlaying it and then sewing it and clipping it?
Because what'll happen if you overlap it, you could get, I know it's kind for me, it's kind of a split the hairs kind of thing, but it sometimes will make a weird shape in the ripple of the coat. So having there be no bulk there is that you're not going to have it show in the curve of the coat as you wear it.
I'm fascinated. I've never seen this before. I'm just,
Yeah. It's just, these are just little things that I have found over the years that I just know to do. And so, yeah. And because, see, ideally, this is when you have like bushel baskets full of money, you could just cut one big long strip of bias if you have a huge piece of canvas. But, if you're just buying a half yard, which is what you need for this coat, this is the way to splice it so that it still looks like one continuous piece.
it's great. Thank you.
Okay.
And the serpentine is much prettier, but is there any other advantage over of the serpentine over a zigzag?
I think the serpentine holds this cut edge flatter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So moving right along.
So the strip is pressed. Now I'm going to trim this off here and here. And flip it over.
Yes. Question? There was a question? Okay.
And trim off the excess there and here. So we have a join that doesn't create a hinge, and it's nice and flat. Just trim that down a little bit there. So it's nice and flat. It doesn't add any bulk. You won't. This will not read through the hem allowance. We have our strips prepared. Voila. Next, we go to the coat. Here we have the coat on the table. And you can see here, I'm drawing a line. And this is going to be where the hem allowance folds. Now I'm over here. I've worked ahead, as you can see. So let me explain here. This is the stitching line for the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now the facing is going to end somewhere out here. So you need a little extra of this hem allowance to tuck in behind the facing. So this here blends to the 1.5 inch hem allowance. So that's really what I'm doing here is I'm just marking that 1.5 inch hem allowance. Now you notice I'm using a wax chalk as opposed to a disappearing chalk. This is on the inside and I want those marks to stay put until I get everything situated. So here, that is the cut edge, or that's going to be the folded edge. So what we want to do here, I'm going to come back over here. Let's just rearrange this. There we are. What I want to do with my bias strip is I'm going to cut this off perpendicular. I'm going to bring it here. And I'll stop at about 1/4 inch. Well, it'll be about 3/4 inch from the cut edge. So I'm going to pin this so that the cut edge of the bias strip is on the chalk line. This is step one. So we're almost to the end. And so here I'm going to cut the other end about 3/4 inch from the cut edge. You don't want it to go all the way up to it. Now that we positioned it, next we will baste. Now the basting, this is just going to hold the strip in place until we have it all sewn in. But what I'm going to do here, as you can see, I'm just doing a tailor baste, sewing a tailor baste about 1/2 inch up from the cut edge. We just want to hold that down. Okay, almost done. we are. From here, what I want to do, I'm going to get a needle and thread and bring it back, and I'm going to catch stitch this upper edge just about the width of the facing. I don't want this to curl over time, so just catch stitching it up here for now. It will keep it nice and tidy. So I will be right back with the needle and thread. So really, this isn't a lot of catch stitching, and obviously you want to use a very light tension so that this doesn't read through to the front, but you just want to hold that edge up behind the facing. So I want to do this on both ends of this strip, and I will sew this one here and come back when I have the other one sewn. So I will finish this one here and then sew the other one off camera, bring it back, show you the results. There we are. That is what it's going to look like up close. You can see not terribly short stitches, just to hold this up. So I'll return with the other side sewn. So here we have the other end of this strip catch stitched to the body. Now, before I go any further, one thing I like to do is to thin out the seam allowances here. So if you cut these down to about 1/4 inch, this is a form of grading. So the object here is that you want this portion of the hem allowance to be a little narrower than this so that you don't have seam allowance laying over seam allowance. And over here, same thing. Trim those down to about 1/4 inch. So we have reduced bulk. Wherever you can reduce bulk, that's a good thing. Okay, so next, we are going to pin the hem allowance up and fold it. We're going to fold it right on the cut edge of the bias strip. I'm not going to take this all the way over. I'll probably take it over to midway between the side seam and the front. The beauty here is having this bias strip is going to help you fold because the fabric will naturally want to fold on that cut edge. I'm going to stop it, right about 2 inches away because we have to put the facing on. So this will help us get some of the hem done before we actually put on the facing. So I will go off camera because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin this up and then I'm going to baste it because the next step is hand stitching. So I'll bring it back, pinned and basted. Almost done. I'm going to show you this here. This is what's called an uneven basting stitch. You leave about 1 inch or so, and then you stitch 2 running stitches. We're almost done. Then I'll explain the beauty of the uneven basting stitch. Now, the beauty of the uneven basting stitch, if you have 2 short and 1 long, there we are, yeah. You have the 2 short and 1 long. If you clip every other long basting stitch, it's easier to pull the basting out. So now the hem is basted. What I will do next is to sew a hemming stitch. Now I'm going to be using orange thread for this, but it won't show because I'm going to catch it to the the interfacing here. This is the stitch that I like because it works so nicely and it doesn't show from the front. So I'll go get some orange thread and come right back. So we're ready here to sew the hemming stitch. This is why I baste, because I find it's easier to baste to hold everything together than trying to dodge around pins. So the stitches themselves are going to be about 1/4 of an inch from this cut edge here. So what I like to do is fold this back. And so I'm going to come out. Now this is, you come out through and you just catch 1 or 2 yarns of your fabric. And then you don't go through the fabric again, you just go straight back. This is all stab stitches. And you want the tension fairly loose here. Just barely catch. And these stitches are about 1/4 of an inch apart. So again, just barely catch. Now, the thinking behind this, the rationale behind this is that if you were to use a catch stitch, what happens is that the catch stitch will pull the face fabric up over the cut edge. In this stitch, the catch stitch or the stitch sits on the same plane as the bias strip. So there's no tug against the fabric. The two surfaces are pretty much flat. Now in a boucle, you could sew this with Frankenstein stitches and no one would know. But if you're sewing, say, a gabardine, you will truly appreciate this because it doesn't really read through the fabric. So I know this is like watching paint dry, but I'm going to sew just a few more. Get past this seam here. So yeah, about 1/4 of an inch from the cut edge of the hem allowance and just barely catch. So it's, when you go in through the hem allowance, you pick up just that 1 or 2 threads. Now, if you're hemming a fabric that, like a gabardine that really shows, one thing I like to use is machine rayon embroidery thread because it's finer. And I like also to use a number 10 beading needle. They're sharp, they're thin, they make it so that you can pick up 1 yarn of the fabric from behind and you get a minimal show through. Okay, I will go off camera and finish this and bring it right back. That's what it looks like from here. It's a little curvy because I'm doing this through the computer. See, you don't see anything on the face. I will return with the finished stitching. Okay, finished. So now let me pull out here, show you the result. There you are. And show it from the other side. Even with the orange thread, it doesn't really show. Again, I've got a little dispensation because I've used a backing on this, but it doesn't show. Now next, I'm going to take out the basting. This is where I'm going to show you about the uneven basting, how wonderful it is. So we have a long one here. We cut this one. Long one here, cut this one. Long one here, cut this one. So you just There you go. That's how it works. I will remove the rest of the basting and meet you over at the pressing table.
So this is polyester thread
Yeah,
or?
this is the white is the Mara 30. Yeah.
Okay.
So before we do pressing, are there any questions so far? Okay, then.
So here we are with all of the basting on this section removed. I've left the basting here until later when I attach the facing. But a lot of this you can remove beforehand, and then you just want to steam it over the ham. A snag. Okay, so there we are. You steam it into the shape that the coat forms when you wear it. So the combination of the bias strip and the stitching and the steaming will make it so that it doesn't create unsightly points. I don't like a hard press on here. It's considered bad form if you have a crease along this line. So you can see I'm just steaming and finger pressing. So I'll give you a little close up on that so you can enjoy it. See how beautiful. And there is the inside. From here, we install the facing. This is a long view of
Kenneth,
coat.
Yes.
So what I'm
so on, is it, I mean, well, I know we're just making this coat, but is it bad form? Are all hems supposed to just roll?
In the couture, yes. And the reason, actually, I had this conversation with my students today. The thing about putting a hard crease on a hem is if you want to let the hem down, then you have that crease.
Okay.
So in the couture, generally, the hem allowances are deeper. So yeah, so having just a roll rather than a hard crease makes it so that if you want to make it a little longer, you don't have to go to Herculean efforts to get rid of that crease. That's
Is that for the cuff as well?
yes, same thing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So other questions?
I have a question. And so the top edge of the bias is just gonna, it's got enough, like we don't need to attach the top edge of the bias to
Right.
the, it's just gonna stay up there.
It's going to stay up there, yes, because you've sewn it probably. You probably have sewn it. You may have a half, 3/4 of an inch at the most between the cut edge and the hem stitching, so that will keep it in place. Now, in this area here, there's no hem stitching, and that's why we did some catch stitching of the bias strip in this area here because it doesn't have any support, but along the rest of the hem, that is plenty of support for it.
So I have interlined my coat
Mhm.
and I just catch the interlining rather than trying to go in, catching the fabric. Will, the fashion fabric, will
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
be enough?
Yeah, when you're hemming, you notice I really just caught the inner lining or the
Okay.
interfacing. Yeah, because see, that is one of the beauties of an inner lining. A lot of people say, why would you go to that trouble? Well, aside from making the garment hang differently, one of the advantages of an inner lining is that you can, if you want to tack your seam allowances down, you can tack your seam allowances down. If you want to tack your hems up, you can tack your hems up, and it will not read from the front. Okay. So other questions? Let's see if there's any in the chat just to, what is this? If an underlining was used, would you catch only the underlining or also the face fabric? No, to reiterate, that's the answer. Okay, so let us continue.
What I'm doing here is I'm pinning all the way around, but I'm not pinning the lower portion that blends with the hem. As you can see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. As you can see, the collar is between the facing and the body of the garment. So it's pinned right now. What I like to do is I like to hand baste with the thread that I will be using in the machine. That way you don't have to worry about dodging around the pins. It just makes everything a little easier when you're handling this. I will go off camera and do just that. Okay, so here we're coming to the end of the facing. And now you'll see why I like to base these in two different passes. At this point, we want to smooth the facing out. And then we want to pick this up by 1/4 of an inch. Now you've built this in because if you notice when you pick this up, these two edges meet. But I just like to ensure that that extra 1/4 of an inch is there before I pin and sew the two lower ends of the facing. I just find that's, it's just insurance. And so yes, when this is laying flat on the table, you're going to have a little bit of a wobble. Now this extra here, if you don't need it, it will take care of itself. But if you do need it, you will be glad you have it. Otherwise, what you're going to have to do is to take this out and let it out slightly. So I will baste this then.
Kenneth, I don't understand why you would need that extra in there.
Okay. Have you ever sewn a facing onto a jacket or a coat and you get, and the garment curls under right at this point there?
I haven't had enough experience to have that happen, but
Okay.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. And so see, this is something I figured out years ago. I was, because when I first really started doing tailor garments, I had to do dinner jackets, and I was noticing that it would buckle right at that hem, right, in that area where we added the 1/4 of an inch in the pattern. And I realized it was just always a 1/4 of an inch. So I figured, well, to hell with it, I'm just going to build it into the pattern. So years later, after I made my bones with the tailoring mafia at FIT, and they said I could ask them any question, that was my first question. And he said, oh, everybody knows that. And I said, oh, okay. And so it just gives you enough extra so that you don't have to worry about the facing pulling up on the garment and create a buckle. So that's really what that's for.
But it doesn't create like bagginess inside or anything like that. It all just, it's only a 1/4 of an inch. So it just kind of eases out.
Right. Because if you think about it, that 1/4 of an inch will distribute all the way along the joint.
Yeah.
So yeah. So if you don't need it, no harm, no foul, but you generally will use it. Okay.
That was more an academic question.
But that's okay. These are questions to ask because, little things like this is, these are the little things, especially when I studied with my teacher, Simone, there were a lot of little tiny things that we learned that answered all sorts of questions. And so this is one of those. Okay. Okay. Back to work.
And once this is basted, we will be ready to go to the machine. So I will baste this end, I will prepare the other end, and I will bring this back here to the work table before we go to the machine. So here we have the facings all basted into place. And our next step really will be sewing this. I'm not going to make you watch me sew this because it's pretty straightforward. You sew everything at 1/2 inch. However, I'm going to show you some details once we get to the pressing table about sewing.
I have some
I've
questions.
decided.
Okay.
I have a concern about the thickness around the collar.
Okay.
Because when I was sewing the pocket latches, my machine really didn't like some of those thicknesses. And here you're sewing through 4 layers.
Yes.
Plus wherever there's trimmed seam.
Right.
So, but are there any other than, the hump bump things that you can do? Is there any trick in terms of my presser foot was showing that it wasn't down because the loft was so much with all the layers? Is there any advice for how to address that?
One thing you could do is before you take it to the machine, see if you can press the seam allowances as flat as possible and get some of that flattened out.
Okay.
But other than that, because I don't know what machine you have, if I'm running into a lot of thicknesses, this is where I will just hand crank the machine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not very elegant, but it works. And it may take you a little bit to get through all those layers, but because what I do like about my Bernina, it will stitch through just about anything. But other machines, for one reason or another, may not be able to handle the thicknesses quite so much. So hand cranking it is an option.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So other questions? Okay, well, back to the sewing.
Actually, to show you what I'm going to do on the lower ends of the facing. So we're going to continue sewing to the corner. And then we're going to turn this over this way to sew the lower ends. See, this way we can get the stitch because we start the stitching where the facing begins, which is right about there. So I'm going to put a pin. So that's where the edge of the facing starts. And so we will use the line we drew earlier. Here we are. To begin our stitching and use that as our stitching line. That way we don't end up catching this by a strip of canvas. We can sew right next to it. Now what we can do is come up to this corner here, shorten that stitch down to 0.75. So right to that row of stitching, stitch a couple across, and then sew up about 3/4 of an inch. And that then will reinforce that corner. So let me turn this a little bit, pull it out a tiny bit, so you can see what I've done here. Let's turn it from this side. So you can see I started the stitch right there. And we sewed along that line you drew right outside the canvas over to this stitching line and then sewed the corner. And there you have it. Now we'll go to the pressing table. So here we are at the pressing table, And what I've done here is I've folded, there's our center back seam. I folded on the center back to see that, okay, our two collars are the same. And then I also wanted to just check to make sure that the distance from the collar to the intersections is the same. Because at this point, you can take the seam out, let the seam in a little bit to make sure that both of these corners match. It's much more difficult once you've pressed and turned it right side out. So that's a little bit of insurance I like to take before I start pressing and clipping. As always, we press it as sewn before we go any further, which I will do off camera. This is now where we get the point presser and press all of the seam allowances open. On the corners here, as I did on the collar, much easier to press everything open first before we trim the corners. So again, I will go off camera and press all of these seam allowances open and return back here. And here we have the last pressing. So back to the work table. Here we are back at the work table. And one thing I have done here, you can see, I have marked where the top button is, because what we want to do, we're going to be clipping our corners. We will be clipping the curves at the neck because everything is sewn. And then we will be grading the seams. Set the hem. And so I will work up the front. I know this seems heavy going, but it's good to see how this trims. So now we're getting close to this point here. So then we—
How much are you trimming off?
I'm grading it down to 1/4 inch.
Thank you.
So the thinking on this is when you're grading, there's what I call the public side and then the body side. The public side is what faces out. So the seam allowance that is right underneath the public side is the wider one. So below the break point where the top button is, we narrow it to 1/4 inch because the facing is going to be on the inside. But at this point, we're going to transition to nothing, a little bit above the break point, and then we're going to trim the seam allowances on the other side of the lapel part to 1/4 inch, because that then is going to be on the private side, the body side. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
right there. So if you look at the seam allowances, you can see this tapers off to nothing, within 1/2 inch of this mark here. So now I'm going to flip the work over. And we're going to trim starting here, and this is on the body side. We will trim that same 1/4 inch. See, the object of grading is that the public side has the wider seam allowance because it pads out the narrower seam allowance underneath. Okay, so here we are. And so this then tapers to nothing there. Now we are ready to press. So here we are at the pressing table. As you can see, I've worked ahead and I'm turned one of the facings right side out. And I will turn the other facing right side out before we press. Really, the techniques that we used when we constructed the collar, we're going to be using on this as well to get the sharp corners. So I won't really repeat them here. So I will go off camera and turn this facing right side out, and we will begin to press. I like to press this in 2 stages. First is below the top button, where we favor the seam to the facing. So when I press this, it works best to give it some steam. And finger press it just to get everything set. And also, you just want to make sure you don't press any more creases into this than you need to. So here. And there we are. Now, this is where the clapper comes in. I explain to my students at FIT that the reason you would use a clapper as opposed to putting the iron down is if you don't want to put shine on your fabric. Also, when you're pressing, you want the heat and the steam to saturate into the fabric, but then you want natural materials, wood, cotton, to draw the moisture and heat away. That is the premise behind the clapper. So I'm just going to work my way up. It's a little slow going, but we'll enjoy it here. And so there's the top button. So we're going to stop pressing. This is the first step. Now, I want to show you what you're looking for. See how that seam rolls ever so slightly back? That's what you want. You don't want the seam sitting dead on that edge. You want it to roll slightly back. You've built that into the pattern. This is where we exploit that in the pressing. Now, like I said, I like working in sections here. So what I will do now is I have my basting thread in the needle, and I like to just sew a tailor baste to hold this edge. Then you don't have to worry about it flapping around so much. Now, coming up to here, again, you want to see where your mark is, because that's where we're going to stop the basting, or a little bit before. You could stop it a couple inches below. But you just want this all to be secured. So there we are. It favors to the facing. Next, I want to press this above. Now that we have the lower half of the facing sewn, we're going to press and baste the lapel portion. So this is where the sleeve board comes in. We want the seam to favor back when we're steaming and pressing. And so again, I like to work it in sections. Also, the beauty of steaming this over the sleeve board is you can build a little bit of roll into this. So now, that's what we're gonna do. And to crisp up that corner, again, with the pressing cloth this time because I don't want to mar the fabric. There you go. And as we like to let that cool, and then we want to tailor base this as well. See, ultimately, I'm going to top stitch around this edge, but I want to have everything pressed and basted in place so that nothing shifts before the top stitching gets sewn. And just turn the corner here. Next, I will press the facing back along the neck seam. Now we want to press the seam allowances on the neck seam down. I will press first and then I will understitch later.
Now, you didn't grade that seam
This
at
is
all,
where the
did you?
clapper.
Not really. You know, you could, if you wanted to, go in. Actually, I believe I did. You can go in there. I would grade the facing seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Really comes in handy. Sorry, I'm blocking that. And having the sleeve board is going to be a really handy tool because you can really place this so that the shaping at the shoulders is accurate. And there's no race here. You can steam it, finger press it. You can come in, press it with your clapper. The object here is to have all of the seam allowances facing down. So I will go off camera and finish this and bring you back the result. Almost done. There we have it. Now, that is the seam pressed. Our next step is going to be going to the work table to pick stitch the seam allowances. So here we are back from the pressing table, And I have threaded up a needle with Mara 30, the top stitching thread. What we want to do now is we're doing what's called understitching. So we're going to pick stitch the seam allowances to the facing. Now, for this particular fabric, you're never going to see it because the texture is so high. But it's just good to show you. So pick stitch is a little tiny back stitch. And if you're working on a fabric that has a smooth surface, these will read like little dots. So obviously spacing is key. And so really you want to stitch this, I'd say about 1/4 inch from the seam. Now what I'm doing is I'm sewing just the seam allowances. You don't want to catch the main body. Now this functions the same way as understitching a facing on a neckline. That's the same principle we're doing here. This will keep all the seam allowances where we want them. So I will, can't seem to hit the frame here. So as you can see, it doesn't really show. So I will go off camera and sew the rest of this and bring you back the result. Okay, almost done. One more. And back through into here. And secure the thread. So the beauty of this, you can see right now, is that it flattens out this seam and keeps all the seam allowances in place. So there we are. Next, we're going to finish the hem. Now here we have just this little bit of hemming to do before we're finished with this video. Now, aren't you glad that you did all of this beforehand? So really, you're going to pin this up. And I like to baste. I know some people think I'm a little persnickety that way, but really, I don't like catching my sewing thread on pins. So I find it very annoying. So there we have this. And now, really, if you remember the stitch we sewed this with, you're going to sew the same stitch. Now, I stop it about 1 inch from the edge of the facing. So from here to here, I will sew with the hem stitch. I will also use the orange thread so you can see what I've done, but I will do that off camera because you've seen that already. And I will return with the finished result. And there we have it. We also have dueling sirens outside. I don't know what that's about, but this is New York. So again, you can see that I've stopped this about 1 inch from this facing here. I will remove the thread basting and we will go to the pressing table for one final press. So as always, we press on the pressing ham and just a little bit of steam. See, it makes a nice curve. And just continue that press around. Allow it to cool. And while I'm here, what the heck, let's just press the other end because I have already sewn that. There we go. I'll let this cool for a moment and I will meet you back at the work table so we can survey the results. And suddenly, it looks like a coat. Now, what I'm planning on doing is I am planning on top stitching the fronts, but I will sew those off camera. But you can see the facings are on. The hem is finished. And once the fronts are top stitched, the next lesson will be installing the lining and finishing.
Okay. Are your brains full?
Yes.
Totally.
Yes. So questions. Yes, Lisa.
Okay, so I remember when you were putting the collar and the facing on, and after you stitched it, you checked that the collar was at the same point from the center back, right? Do
Yes.
you do anything for the lower edge to make sure that, you know, the coat at the bottom is even when it's closed?
You know, it's a good idea to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. See, you know, I believe check whenever possible if you have any kind of questions or, you know, if you think, oh, it might have stretched. Because see, you have stay tape on the body and on the facing. So the likelihood of one kind of being a little bit off kilter is minimal, but still, it's better to be safe than to put the darn coat on later and go, damn.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So other questions?
When you're doing the chain stitch top stitching,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
that needs to show on the front of the lapel,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
but also excuse me. I have a monster dog. Get down. Needy but big.
Yeah.
So it's going to show on the lapel, but then it also needs to show down the front.
Right.
So do you do the chain stitch all the way up on both sides and all the way down, or do you stop it?
Well, what I did on, you know, on this part is I did the chain stitch down to a little bit past where the button is. So it would kind of go to the inside. And then I started on the underside, I started a little bit above and then came down the front so that
Okay.
it shows. And so what I did on this, I cheated a little bit because the fabric had such a high texture. I did a long machine based all the way through all the layers, all the way down. And so the chain stitch only sews to the visible layer. So you don't see the float of the chain stitch behind. You'll see some of the top stitch, but like I said, the texture was just so high that it just sort of vanishes.
So, because I'm using a braid, a cord,
Yeah.
but and I've just like I also have a needy cat. So I just attach that to the top.
Yes.
So there is no stitching underneath. So that whole sandwiching it all together using top stitching isn't what I'm doing. I'm just really applying it to the top.
Well, you know, you could actually, if the braid would cover the top stitching, you could have a top stitch all the way down and have the braid show, you know, kind of like I did, where it kind of disappears and then have it on the top, but then you would have the top stitching behind, because I like having a top stitch to hold all those layers together.
Right. Okay, because that isn't what I had done on the other pieces. And I was wondering if I should.
You know, for the collar, you can get away with not doing it. I think on the front, you'll be happier if you have a top stitch holding all the layers together. It just gives it a little, you know, when you're holding, it gives it a little more heft.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So other questions?
So if you were
Yes.
machine top stitching, would you also do that in 2 passes? You would top stitch from the button down, and then maybe, I don't know, and then, I mean, I can see with your hand top stitching, but on a machine, like I'm machine top stitching.
Well, the question I would ask, because see, I'm lucky enough, I have the Bernina or the Singer 301A, and a featherweight will do the same thing. If you, with those machines, you can put top stitching thread in the needle and in the bobbin. And so when you sew it, it looks the same from both sides. So you can just sew it all the way down in one pass. You know, that's something that you would want to experiment and see if your machine would do. But other than that, you know, if you were doing, because there's another way of, you know, if your machine doesn't like top stitching thread, you can thread 2 threads into the needle. And so in that sense, I would do it in 2 different passes. Okay. So Paula, you had a question?
Yes. This Raglan coat, is this considered a notched collar?
No. No, this is really
why is it not?
Well, you know,
It's a what?
It creates that thing, but a classic notch lapel, the seam allowance, the join, you know, on this, the collar, all the seam allowances face the body. But on a classic notch lapel, all the seam allowances for the collar all kind of face up into the collar, and the seam allowances on the body and the facing face down.
Okay, so what type of collar is this?
This is, I just call this is a roll collar. That's it's a classic roll collar.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Other questions? No questions? Wow.
I'm curious.
Okay, who's curious?
I'm curious about how long it actually took you to make it. I mean, I could probably add up all the video footage, but
well,
do you sit down in one day and just go for it and record it all?
I can't. Well, oh no, this was because the calculation, I figured 2 hours for 15 minutes of video.
Well,
so it took a good long time to make this coat. Now, if I were just cutting the coat out and kind of hammering it out, I could get it done in a day. But that's just
impressive.
Well, but you see, this is something that I never really thought about, because I just, you know, when you're sewing and you're by yourself and people aren't observing you, you don't really think about it. But years ago, we did this for threads. It was called Smart Sewing Order. You know, it was like order of construction. And so what I had to do, you know, we would show, okay, this is a t-shirt. You know, we had the patterns. Okay, we sew the shoulder seams, and I'd have to run off camera and sew them and come back. Now we put on the neck finish, and then I have to run off camera. And so Judy got to see me doing sewing a lot. And over the years, one day she said, "You sew so fast." And what made me that fast was my teacher, Simone. The homework I had to do in that class, I burned through acres of fabric. I burned through, and I'm not kidding, a refrigerator box full of fabric in that class, and then some to do all the homework. And just to keep up, I had to really crank it out. And I kind of, in my head, I'm looking 2 or 3 steps down the road. So, you know, a coat like this, you know, I can really knock one out in a day. But that's just me. That's just my training. So don't feel like, oh, you know, if I can't do it in a day, then I'm bad, because
I know I devoted 3 days of my weekend to finish the shawl collar jacket, and I still didn't get it done. So I'm just like,
Well, but again, you see, I do this for a living.
I understand.
Money, time is money. And, because I remember early on, I remember someone saying, okay, because perfectionism is a disease. First off, I have to say that. It's a form of fear. You can create the illusion of perfection. And someone said to me early on, okay, you could spend a month doing this, you're going to make $3,000, or you're going to spend 3 days doing this and you're going to make $3,000. Which day rate would you prefer? And so, yeah, I saw really early, like, I'd like to make 1,000 a day as opposed to 1,000 every 30 days. So, or 3,000 every 30 days. So, I got quick. So yeah, but when you're doing it for pleasure, there are times I will just take my time on something. This is where I really kind of go full bore into the tailor jacket with the handset collar and the pad stitching and the taping and all of that sort of thing, which at some point, not until the end of July, I want to do a class, just like the classic tailor jacket with the vents and the whole bit, which, that's kind of down the road. But, I like to take my time and do that. There's something just to kind of like take a leisurely,
I like the format of this class because it breaks it up into small, doable chunks, So every weekend I do what we did this night, and then I feel really good. I got that done. So I really appreciate this format.
Well, I was very fortunate from an early time in my career. I probably talked about this. Sewing Today. I don't know if you remember it. Bernina and Vogue Butterick sponsored. It was 26 episodes on PBS, and the host Nancy Fleming, former Miss America 1961. Her talent was sewing. Hand to God, it's true. You can see it on YouTube. She was charming. She's charming. And I understand why she was Miss America. She was so nice. I was scared out of my wits. I remember the day before being ill, thinking, what have I gotten myself into? And she made it a comfortable experience. So over the years, I've had to do a lot of video and articles for Threads magazine. Really, these are articles for Threads magazine in video form. I've had to think, okay, how do you break it up into sections that are not completely overwhelming? So I'm glad that you all are feeling like you like this. So yes. So now just a little commercial for the next class. I probably won't, because the next class is the one I call the peplum jacket. The double peplum that I did the article on. I probably won't run that until a little later on, because when I signed the contract, I then looked at the due date. The manuscript is due June 1st. So I'm not putting anything else on the calendar until after June 1st, because the manuscript is due June 1st.
Is that the manuscript? Are you writing like an article, or is this?
Well, no, this is the doll couture book. This is, and the story. I think I may have told you this. Well, yeah, I'll show you, because her name is Lola.
Oh my gosh.
She was a showgirl. She wears feathers in her hair, but no more dress cut down to there. And after that unpleasantness with Tony and Rico, she kind of lost her way and spent a lot of time in dive bars and reduced circumstances. But she went to rehab and she got her life back together. So she has shown up with her suitcases to her friends, the Orloff Walensky triplets, a rollerblading girl group from Eastern Europe, in New York. And so they're bringing her to the Kennedy King studio, where we're going to outfit her in a new wardrobe for her new life. In the meantime, the Orloff Walensky triplets, mail order husbands, are restoring her car.
I love it.
So there's that going on. And then, there's going to be instructions. So I like to get ahead. So yesterday I sat down because, on the weekend I was freaking out a little bit. And my friend Jackie said, okay, dude, you've done all the work. You have the patterns, you have the knowledge. just sit down and crank it out. So that's, I'm starting on the kind of the technical parts of it. I have like all the materials and tools chapter written already. So, I'm going to be doing most of the photography, and the story, the doll story part is going to be hilarious. And it is allowing me now to write off all of my purchases of little tiny 1/6 scale things. And I had to make a cutting mat because they need a cutting mat. So yes, but so I'm not going to be doing any more classes till after that is done. So but kind of keep a watch on my Instagram, and I will send out emails for that class. But so yeah,
Great.
it's exciting and scary all at the same time, because we don't have an editor or an art director yet. So I'm like, okay, I can't really take any pictures until we have an art director. So I know kind of where we're going with this aesthetically, but that's fine. Okay, so questions, comments, requests?
I wanted to show my welt pocket.
Okay, let's see it.
I don't know how well you can see. Whoops.
Okay, you disappeared. Oh, there we go.
That's the
Oh,
problem.
look at that.
Wow, good for you. Good job. It
That's
kind of,
very-
you cut in and out, but we can kind of get a sense of it.
Yeah, it's because I'm using that background.
Okay. Wow, good job.
Yeah. So I am not able to get every week's homework done on time, but working through it slowly.
That's good.
But one of the things I have discovered, as I said, it may be time for me to get a better sewing machine.
What I would recommend, because I love Bernina's, I really do.
Yeah.
What I did this year, because as much as I love I have a 1230, a 1260, two 1230s, a 1260, and an 1130. I bought some mechanical Bernina's from the 80s.
Mhm.
And those machines they just go and they go. So, and you're not going to end up spending, because the machines now, I had one, the new 930, $14,000 that machine cost. I didn't pay that for it. Someone gave it to me. Long story, but I finally just traded it in for another one because it was way too much machine.
Yeah, I find them very intimidating, especially all the computerized and all the stuff. It's like, I don't need.
Well, you see, the thing is,
figure
I
that
don't want
out.
to, I wait for my computer to boot up, but I don't want to wait for my sewing machine to boot up. So, no, seriously. So do consider, because, you could find a Bernina dealer who can find you one, or, I have bought some on eBay. And like I said, those machines just go and go and go.
Okay.
So do consider something like that, because it won't cost you the earth, and someone else will have taken the depreciation, and you're going to have a machine that you're just going to adore.
Well, thank you for that advice.
Okay.
I did, and I also did reach out to that Mulberry Silk to help find some buttons, and
Yes.
so
Yeah, they're lovely people there. I fully, I think we should support local independence whenever possible. Okay, so other questions? Anyone else want to do any show and tell? I mean, not required if you don't want to. Okay, then, well, I'm going to turn off the recording. I think our work is done.